Hi, my name is Susanne Janssen. I'm the editor-in-chief of Living City, the United States. We started this journey for the Inclusive Economy Report to get a gauge of the current state of economic inclusion and level of inclusive growth across the globe, to see how serious this issue is, and also to see which areas are the most critical ones. The goal is to understand the different regions of the world better, and also to understand the difference among developed nations, among developed and developing countries in a more insightful way, so we can develop better policy proposals to tackle these unsustainable and destabilizing differences. Here are the most important insights of the report. Less than 50% of people receive equitable access or inclusion to the 5 measured aspects of economic inclusion and drivers of inclusive growth. This is an insufficient ratio, and while this may not be surprising, it is a very important fact to keep in mind. This is the base where we are now and from where we have to start. The issue of inequality has been here with us for quite some time. The data has highlighted it for a long time, and there have been serious efforts to better the situation. Yet inequality continues to burden the 21st century. So our question is, how should we shape solutions for a better impact? What was even more surprising for us in these data was to find that the G7 nations, the most advanced economies, didn't perform all that better than developed countries as a whole, even though they were supposed to be the leading economies of the developed world. It arose the question whether the assumption that the higher the level of development or advancement of an economy brings with itself automatically a higher level of inclusion. The report's finding is that inclusion, access to the benefits of development, cannot be expected automatically as a trickle-down effect, so to say, but it has to be part of the design. It has to be part of the policy principles that are being developed. Réka, you are an economist, former ambassador of Hungary in the United States, and a board member of Nuova Global. What can be done if we cannot assume that the free market economic system will automatically bring about inclusion? Can it somehow be designed in?
Susanne, thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion, and congratulations for Nuova Global and for the report that was produced. I'm very glad to be part of this discussion, and I'm very excited and thrilled about the topics that are being covered by the report. This report really raises a number of very important and thought-provoking insights and gives us a great set of intellectual as well as policy tools for the entire international community to refocus on this really fundamental question. Is access to the benefits of development in our societies automatic, or do they need additional policy tools to be ensured? Just for the sake of accuracy, I do have a PhD in economic history and have worked extensively on energy issues, but I've always worked on the strategic aspect of these challenges. So I'm not an economist. The correct way to see my background is to call me a strategist studying international affairs. But I think this gives us a good enough background to discuss the report. So the question of the report that is raised by the report is one that will be defining for the 21st century. Many economists and development experts around the world tend to agree now that development is possible in a sustainable way. Newer and newer proposals are being published on how, for instance, even climate change can be turned from pressure to an inspiring new challenge. But there's much smaller focus on how to ensure in all of these that access to the benefits of the development become open to all. So it is of great interest to develop policy proposals that can be implemented in any country that promote or create a focused effort for this. So having said this, and especially today, after a year and a half of the pandemic and this sense of urgency and interconnectedness that was created by this, it is a priority now to consider how to shape the post-globalization and the post-pandemic era. It is a very important challenge for us to note that people around the world seem to express similar reactions when it comes to the negative effects of extreme globalization, for example, that has been highlighted by the report. In my view, decision makers and thought leaders are today challenged to design new and sustainable methods of national, regional, and truly international collaboration with a clear goal for the betterment of the lives of people and countries and of our planet as a common value for all.
Réka, you mentioned our planet. In the light of the effects of climate change, which we are already experiencing, what could be a road to collective actions to drive real change?
Yes, indeed. We need to measure such outcomes to be able to show tangibly how such collaborations are bringing real change and impact for communities and for countries. Eventually, the mission of this conference and of Nova Global is such to raise awareness, shape national and international thinking with a view of the whole. Without understanding the interconnectedness of our world, no long-term solutions can be worked out. Do we want to achieve peace in our country? We cannot ensure this without thinking beyond the borders of our country. Just as an example, there are many signs of a renewed effort for cooperation, despite the still existing conflicts and tensions in the world that are, that shouldn't be underestimated for sure. But it is a very thought-provoking message, for example, in Chiara Lubic's UNESCO Peace Education Prize acceptance speech, that after the fact that many of efforts that aimed at resolving the world's problems in a global manner collapsed, there are multiple new efforts led by desires that are based on the understanding of the oneness, of the unity of the world. This thought comes up in several ways in discussions with her discussions with political leaders, in various speeches to UN, EU, and so on. But choosing community and cooperation from this perspective does not have to be in contradiction to particular interests, national values, or even the profit sense of business, but it is a precondition for developing sustainable policies. I find it of great importance. Choosing humanity, adding to people's sense of national belonging in every country is key for the 21st century's challenges. There's not one challenge ahead of us in the 21st century that can be solved by lesser cooperation. If anything, every single challenge ahead of us require more cooperation. What is important is that it is a cooperation of the nations too. In order to achieve sustainable solutions for development and even for peace, national identity will not be less important for the 21st century. If anything, it will be more important. But a strong cooperation of the nations is going to be key, and it will have to be clearly defined. National heritage, belonging, and interest will increasingly have to include the ability and the interest to cooperate. Otherwise, it will only too easily lead to an increase in conflicts in the international arena. So it is of great importance to develop new forms and ways to measure and show how cooperation makes all participants more resilient and more successful, create more access to the common benefits. This is why it is a very welcome message to me that a key outcome of this inclusive economy report of Nova Global is to launch a new methodological index to measure the positive effects of cooperation for shaping a better functioning economy, better functioning communities, altogether a planet that is better for all its inhabitants, if you might want to say a better planet. Okay, so one thing that came to my mind is that this report calls this the United World Score. This is an interesting and thought-provoking tool, I have to tell you, from a professional point of view, to help track impact on peoples and communities through measuring three elements. First, the level of shared capability development for peoples and communities, the level of shared R&D towards innovation for common good, and the level of shared opportunities for growth and interdependence.
Thanks, Réka. If we manage to get that method done in 2022, it will be useful as a tool to help policymakers and businesses assess their contribution to global unity and resilience. Now, in the Inclusive Economy report, there are other interesting findings, and I'd like to discuss them with you. Overall, on a global scale, across the 5 dimensions measured, the survey results reflected that the biggest area of the gap in terms of economic inclusion relates to equal access to job or employment opportunities, with only 20.2% of respondents agreeing that this is achieved in their country of residence. Whereas the area perceived to have the smallest gap relates to adequate inclusion in civic participation, with 38.1% of respondents voting in agreement. The area of civic participation is also the only area where less than 50% of the respondents disagreed that it was being achieved. Another surprising finding is that the wealthiest nations, the G7, got the worst results in terms of equal access to job opportunities. Réka, can you tell us what you found to be of particular interest to you in our report?
Oh, many things, but probably the issue itself of shaping an inclusive economy. It is certainly a very complex and multifaceted issue, but certainly one that merits serious discussion from many aspects. The report shows, for example, as I read it, that when looking at developing countries, the most significant gap, developing countries we're talking about, the most significant gap was measured in public access to quality healthcare and housing, with 90.4% disagreeing that this was being achieved. While the area perceived to have the smallest gap was inclusion in civic participation, with 16.9% in agreement. So while this could be expected in some ways, with governments in many developing countries being poorly resourced, in this context, it highlights a strong potential. In countries where civic participation is accessible for almost all, as we see this strong, the good numbers, the chances of narrowing the gap, for example, the gap of access to healthcare, are significantly greater. So this obviously requires different policy tools than the situation in countries where civic participation in itself is inaccessible for a majority of the population. Then I also found of interest to see some regional differences that the report highlights. In Europe, for instance, the report shows that the area found to have the biggest gap of accessibility was the access to jobs or employment, with 43.4% disagreeing that this was being achieved. The area perceived to have the smallest gap was in access to quality education, with 55% in agreement. In contrast, I found it fascinating as an international relations expert and a person who's focusing, not an Asia expert, obviously, but still I found it of giving real insight in the report that it highlights that in Asia, the area that was surveyed to have the biggest gap was in access to quality healthcare and housing, with 83.3% disagreeing, and this was achieved. Whereas the area perceived to have the smallest gap was in inclusion in civic participation, with 55.6% in agreement. In North America, the area surveyed to have the biggest gap was in access to quality healthcare and housing, with 74.6% disagreeing that this was being achieved. Whereas the area perceived to have the smallest gap was in inclusion in civic participation, with 32.4% in agreement. Or South America is a comparison also. The area that was surveyed to have the biggest gap was in access to quality healthcare and housing, with 93.9% disagreeing that this was being achieved, where the area perceived to have the smallest gap was in inclusion in civic participation, with 13.3% in agreement. So obviously, like I said, I'm no expert in Asia or South America, but as a European, I found it, and as an international relations expert, and I found it surprising really to see that access to jobs was still such a high problem. With all the developments of cooperation in the framework of the of the European Union designed for this and functioning on this logic. Also, an interesting and important thing that is highlighted by these survey results that I found for international relations experts and decision makers and international organizations as well, and even strategists like myself, is to focus on sources of instability and conflict. The problem of economic equality and inclusive growth is prevalent throughout the world. Compared to its importance for the average voter, the people as of today, it stands out as a critically unaddressed issue, I believe. Many of these issues in the report are issues that experts and international organizations have been following for decades, really. I remember, my studies, and from the early 90s, reports from the 70s, it's not a new issue. But they are issues, which is a real warning. If they have been on for several decades, and the question is ahead of us still, really have to ask ourselves as experts and as civil, participants in our societies, what can be done to make a difference? Political decision makers have a role in this, for sure, but not only they. These crises need the focus and action of multiple stakeholders, down to the average voter. The greatest challenge and our responsibility, thus, as I see after having read the report, is really to reach out, to develop a cooperation among the different stakeholders, and to start now to shape an inclusive economy. To borrow another phrase from Chiara Lubich, who termed it the culture of giving. This sense of a greater planetary family is expressed also in the analysis of interconnectedness that we saw throughout the pandemic, but also emerging in many phenomena in the world. It is a thought that is intriguing, it's inviting. And this is why the work of Nova Global is so important, in my understanding. Out of concern for our world, we all follow the bad news. But out of the same concern, it is also worth looking at the good news, look at the best practices that have worked actually in real situations. It is a way to uncover many unsung heroes who are working daily to build an inclusive economy, which I find, fascinating and impressive and inspiring. But it's also a very important way to solve problems, to hack the problems in a positive sense. And on this basis, to develop a new design, develop policy proposals that will lead us not just to solving one problem, but also to creating the international dynamics for sustainable solutions by design. So I think the report highlights it rightly that there has to be a design for this. But this is a mission of Nova Global that I think is well worth getting engaged in and certainly very well worth supporting.
Thanks, Réka, what you have shared, which is so important. It's time for positive solutions and not the obvious bad news. So with this, we like to conclude the session. We will be ready to launch the Inclusive Economy Report in different countries in the first quarter of 2022. We are now seeking sponsors for the print versions and to help us promote the ideas in this report to influence policymakers and the business community. If you like to support this project or be part of it in any way, please contact us at info@nuovaglobal.org. Thank you, Réka.
Thank you, Susanne, and thank you and congrats for Nova Global for this wonderful event.